Well, we have been away from the book of Acts for a while, haven't we? We had Easter, and then last week I was recuperating, and Hunter knocked it out of the park. So I appreciate having a pastor that can pinch hit when I need him, and I called him didn't call him. I texted him because I had a tube down my throat. I texted him from the hospital saying, "Brother, you're up to bat. So pull out that sermon that you've been working on and get it ready." And he did, and he knocked it out of the park. I've heard I was here. I got to hear it in person. But I really appreciate that ability to be able to have him step in. So here we are. We are back in the book of Acts. We've been watching in the book of Acts as God has taken his plan. In Acts 1:8, he said, "And go into all the world and make disciples." And this is beginning in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And as we've watched, that's exactly what happened. Jerusalem had a great outpouring. By the time we come to chapter 8 of the book of Acts, there's about 25,000 members in the church of Jerusalem. It's from people from all over the world. They've heard, they came, they're Jewish people who came for the festivals. They got saved in mass numbers, and then they wanted to stay because that's where the Holy Spirit was working. Why would I go home? You know, I'm hearing the apostles teach. God is working. People are getting healed. I want to stay. And God says, I didn't tell you to stay. I told you to go. And so we're introduced in chapter 7, verse 58, of a guy by the name of Saul. Saul was a young Jewish Pharisee from up in Tarsus. He came to Jerusalem to train under Gamaliel, the head rabbi for the Jewish people. And it says in chapter 7 that he was consenting to Stephen's death, his stoning, and they laid their robes at his feet. And as he stood there, he watched as Stephen was stoned, and he said those wonderful words, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And he goes on, he takes the impetus of Stephen's stoning, and he drives it in his vehement hatred of the church. He did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Messiah. And so he said, I'm going to go after this thing he's going to call it the way. So I'm going to go after it with a vengeance. And he's kicking in doors, and he's hauling off people to prison, and even to the point of putting people to death. When Paul shares his story in several different places within the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 22, he tells about how passionately he hated the church. He said, I persecuted this way, the church, to the death, binding and putting both men and women in prisons. Also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to the brethren and started off for Damascus in order to bring even those who were there to Jerusalem as prisoners. In chapter 8, we saw that the gospel headed north. Philip took it to Samaria. Samaria is just north of Jerusalem. And as the gospel heads north, all the way up here in Syria, Damascus, 150 miles from Jerusalem, the gospel has begun to permeate into Damascus. And Saul hears about this, and he says, I am going to go there. And he gets letters from them to go north because he wants to stop the gospel in its tracks. So it's about a 5-day walk from Jerusalem all the way up to Damascus. And during that time, as they head through the desert up into Damascus, he's beginning to think of all of these things that have happened. He's thinking about Stephen. Can you imagine what it would have been like to have been there as he watched Stephen being stoned, and Stephen looks up to heaven and he says, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And then he hears him utter those words, Father, forgive them. A man that he hated with all his being because he preached the gospel. He's going along, and as he's traveling up, he's thinking about all of these people that he's kicked in their doors. He's taken them, thrown them in prison. Some have even been killed. And how did they act when they were arrested? Well, the apostles taught them how to act, right? They rejoiced in being found to being suffering for Jesus. Paul and Silas, in the middle of the midnight hour, they find themselves in a jail in the deepest part of the dungeon, and they're singing praises to God. Can you imagine what Paul was saying? Who are these people? What has happened to them that they can sing in the midst of the fact that I'm throwing them in prison? And he has all these things to think about. He's probably even thinking about this Jesus guy that all of these people are following. Because Jesus preached in the temple, the very temple where Saul would go to meet with Gamaliel to learn about Jewish law. As he was going through the temple, here would be Jesus preaching. He might have been there when the woman was taken in adultery. And they said, we need to stone her. And Jesus said, he who's without sin casts the first stone. Who has forgiveness like that? Who preaches like Jesus preached? Who heals the sick? Who raises Lazarus from the dead? Who can do that? And as he's traveling on his way north, all of these things are running through their mind. You see, sometimes when we think we're running from God, God is saying, listen, brother, I've got you on the run for a reason. Because the reality is I'm after you. You're a soul that I want to be saved. And Jesus is after Saul. So we come to Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, and we're going to read about his journey on the way north. Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, and he asked for letters from him to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And as he was traveling, it happened that he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and it will be told you what you must do. And the men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. And he was 3 days without sight and neither ate nor drank. God was really after Saul, because Saul is going to become as passionate about preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ as he was in persecuting the followers of Jesus. He comes along, he's on the end of the journey, they're almost there. Quite possibly they could have seen Damascus in the distance. Damascus today is one of the oldest inhabited cities in that part of the world. He would have looked and he would have seen Damascus in the distance, saying, "Oh, we're almost there. I'm going to go to the synagogue and I'm going to find these believers in Jesus." And God says, "No, you won't." And it says, suddenly a light shone around him. Suddenly he was knocked to the ground, and he hears a voice. And not only does he hear the voice, but so do the men around him. And as he looks up, he sees the resurrected Jesus, but he doesn't know what the resurrected Jesus looks like. He probably had seen Jesus in the temple, but he had not seen the resurrected Jesus. And even some people, like Thomas, he said, "I got to lay hands on you to know that you're truly Jesus, resurrected." And the resurrected Jesus knocks him to the ground. And you know, I appreciate the fact of when people get saved in a dramatic fashion. One of my best friends, Tom Hall, he and I have been in ministry together for almost 40 years now. And Tom, when we work with kids, Tom tells his story. As a young man, he was in a parking garage in Pennsylvania with a needle of heroin hanging out of his arm, and he said, "God, either kill me or save me, but I can't do this anymore." And instead of plunging the heroin into his arm, he pulled it out, and he went home and he flushed all his drugs down the toilet, and he says, "All right, God, here we are." Did not have one day of any kind of withdrawals. And that day, God got a hold of him, and he gets to share his story of how God saved him out of a world of sin. And that's a hard one to follow. So usually when Tom and I are on a trip together, he shares one day, I get to share the next day. Well, how do you follow that? So I usually follow it up with, "Hey, I was born in the drug culture. My mama and daddy drugged me to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and 2 weeks in July so we could get revived. I have a story of being raised in a Christian family. And my faith came along gradually as I learned different things from the gospel, until I was 15 years old, when I realized you can know a lot about Jesus and not know Jesus. And that day on Memorial Stadium, as Bill Glass preached, I got marvelously and wonderfully saved, and I was saved from a life of sin. Not that I never sinned, but I didn't go through what Tom went through. But they're both magnificent stories of God's amazing grace. And Saul has this story of how he's on the road to Damascus. He went from a persecutor to a preacher. He went from hating what Jesus stood for to loving the resurrected Jesus and wanting people to know that. Paul has this amazing, sudden encounter with God. As that Shekinah glory shone down from heaven, I kind of wonder if he was thinking back to that moment when he watched Stephen look up into heaven. and see the Son of God standing at the right hand. But see, he didn't know who he was yet. He didn't know who that was, and so he's going to ask two questions. The first question he asks is, who are you, Lord? That Lord on the end there is like saying, sir. Who are you, sir? He didn't know who he was the Lord yet. All he knew was somebody was speaking to him out of heaven. Who are you? And that's the first question all of us have to answer. Who are you? You know, we have people that they're atheists, and they're like, oh, I don't believe in God. One of those was a guy by the name of Josh McDowell. Oh, Josh was challenged. He said, I don't know what to do this. Either Jesus was a lunatic who was so deep in his delusion that he chose to die on the cross, because Jesus had every opportunity to say, I'm not really the Son of God. He was either delusional, right? He was the greatest con artist of all time, because he convinced 12 guys to be martyred for him. Or he's exactly who he said he was, the Son of God who takes away the sin of the world. And Josh McDowell was challenged. He wanted to prove that Jesus was not the Messiah, that Jesus was not the resurrected Son of God. And in the end, he wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Lee Strobel was another. He was an investigative journalist. And when he got challenged with this Jesus stuff, his editor said, do what you do best. Investigatively search out, is what Jesus says true? And he wrote the book, A Case for Christ. You see, the first thing we have to answer is, who is Jesus? And Paul looked up, and Jesus answered it, and he said, it is I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. See, Saul didn't realize that he was persecuting Jesus. He thought, I'm persecuting the church. I'm persecuting these people who believe in Jesus. And Jesus says, oh, wait a second. Wait a second. If you're persecuting the church, you're persecuting me. Because the church is what? We're the bride of Christ. We're the bride of Christ. Now, I don't know about you, but you can say whatever you want about me. I'm kind of one of those guys that if you say bad things to me, it's going to roll off the backside. I'm okay. Now, not everybody's like that, so we need to be careful about our words, but there are some people that can be pretty cruel. But if you say something about my wife, my bride, gloves are off. I'll protect her to the death. She's my bride. I made a vow before God that I would protect her. And Jesus Christ is the same way. Jesus Christ died for his bride. And he said, Paul, you're persecuting me, and I've tried to get your attention, and you won't listen, but I'm going to change your life. That's who I am. Paul actually then, he's going to ask a second question. We don't see it in this passage, but like I said, Paul tells his story two other times. He tells it in Acts 22, and he tells it in Acts chapter 26. And in Acts chapter 22, he asks a second question. And the second question is, what shall I do? And this time he says, Lord. What shall I do, Lord? And he said to me, the Lord said to me, get up and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that you've been appointed to do. What shall I do, Lord? Great question. If I know who you are, I need to know what you want me to do. I've told the story a number of times, but for those who aren't aware, I'm the living proof of the movie The Christmas Story. Right? You got the little boy, right? And what does he want? He wants a Red Ryder BB gun. And what does Mama say? You're going to shoot your eye out. 17 years old. BB ricocheted off a rock, hit me in the glasses, shattered glass into my left eye. I ended up in surgery and on a Sunday night. And one of the things they forgot to tell me is when you wake up, both your eyes are going to be bandaged shut. I woke up in a panic. I was pulling at tubes, and the nurses had to come in and restrain me to the bed until I was able to be awake enough to know, don't do that. And for 5 days, I laid in a bed over here in Albany Hospital with both my eyes bandaged shut. Now, the interesting thing about being blind like that, just like Saul was, you don't have anything to do. You can't read. You can't watch television. You're laying there going, what? What's going on here? And normally the question that most people ask is, why? Why did you allow this to happen? Why am I blind? And that was where I started. I was all ready to I would take my football career and go on to a small college the next year and play football. And God says, nope. The very first question I asked my doctor when he came in the day after surgery is, will I ever play football again? And he said no. So I laid there in bed, and I had a wonderful pastor, Matt Flood. Matt Flood was a big guy. I think he had size 14 shoes. He always wore wingtips with the leather soles. And this is back in when all the halls in the hospital were tile. And I'd hear him coming, clump, clump, clump. And if he brought his wife, she was about 5 foot nothing. And I'd hear this pitter, patter, pitter, patter, pitter, patter, patter coming along beside him. Every day for 5 days, Matt came and visited me in my hospital room, and he gave me the best advice ever. He says, Ben, don't lay here and ask why, because you'll never be satisfied. He said, you ask what? God, what do you want me to do? And in those 5 days, God says, you know what? You know that I've called you to preach the gospel, because he had. He called me when I was 15 years old. He said, you know that I've called you to preach the gospel. I just want you to be headed down the right path to prepare yourself. What do you want me to do? And that's what Saul did. He said, what do you want me to do, Lord? And he says, listen, I'm going to take you in. Now, he could have said, repent and be baptized, confess your sins. And he could have healed his eyesight right at that moment. But God says, no, I want you to think about this. I want you to spend some time thinking about where you are. And then I'm going to tell you where you're going to go. And so for 3 days, Saul sat in that house in Jerusalem, or in Damascus, sat in that house in Damascus, and all of his sins were rolling through his mind. I believe the sermons that he heard Jesus preach in the temple were rolling through his mind. He's thinking of all of these things, and then God says, I'm going to send somebody to you. Because, folks, the reality is God uses people to bring the gospel. You see, he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, but he didn't receive the Holy Spirit until Ananias came and laid hands on him. For 3 days he was in, and it says that he prayed. He prayed. He was confessing, I believe he was confessing all of those sins of all the people that he had hurt during that time. And so we're introduced to a young man by the name of Ananias. Look at verse 10. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias, and the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias? And he said, Here am I, Lord. And the Lord said to him, Get up and go to the street called Straight, and inquire of the house of Judas for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias, and come in and lay hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he did to the saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name. And he's one of them. But the Lord said to him, Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. So Ananias departed and entered the house and began laying hands on him, saying, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you were coming, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he regained his eyesight and got up and was baptized, and he took food and was strengthened. Can you imagine what it was like to be Ananias? Hey, Ananias. Hey, God. I'm here to do whatever you want. Well, Ananias, there's this guy by the name of Saul. I want you to go witness to him. He's the biggest, baddest biker dude you've ever seen. He's got tattoos up this side and down that side. You want me to go witness to him? Come on. He's never going to come to Jesus. Look how much, he's got all these swastikas on him. He's terrible. It's okay. I've changed him. Really? God called Ananias to go to somebody that nobody else wanted to. The second thing he did is he told them to take a message that was unpopular. What was that message? You're going to tell him all the things he's going to suffer. Really? You want me to go, not only go meet this guy that goes around persecuting the church, but you want me to give him that wonderful message of Jesus Christ that you're going to suffer for my name's sake? You're going to be beaten. You're going to be shipwrecked. You're going to be stoned. You want me to take that message? Yeah, Ananias, I want you to take the message. How many of us would be willing to do that? I mean, how many of us would say, you know what? I'm going to go share with the gospel with the person who abused me. I'm going to go share the gospel with a family member that has disowned me. I'm going to go share the gospel with the people who made fun of me when I was in high school. Oh, God, I can't do that. Really? I died for them. You can't do that? Most of us, we're like going, they're too evil for God to save. Most of you will recognize the name Ted Bundy, one of the worst serial killers in the United States. When Ted Bundy was facing his execution, he asked a number of pastors to come and visit him because he wanted to tell his story. Ted Bundy got saved in prison, and by all accounts was a changed man, and accepted his execution as being part of having to pay the consequences of his life. Everybody refused to talk to him except for Dr. Dobson. James Dobson said, I'll come. He says, I'm not really sure why, but God's told me that I need to come and at least hear your story. For 2 days, Dr. Dobson went, and he said, I'll come on one condition, that I get to record it. Because I don't want people taking my word for what you have to say. And at the end of the 2 days, Dr. Dobson came out, and he said, I truly believe that Ted Bundy was a believer in Jesus Christ. I believe he got saved in prison. That doesn't absolve him of the terrible things that he did, but he indeed, at the end of his life, was a changed man. And in those 2 days, he gave a tremendous testimony. He says, listen, I want to stop people before they get to where I was. He said, I didn't become a serial killer overnight. My journey started with pornography. And if I can save one kid from the life that I went into, it will be worth it. And the majority of the Christian society that Dr. Dobson was part of rejected him. They turned their back on him. How could you? But he said, it's God's amazing grace. And if God could save him, God can save anyone. The question is, do we dare to be an Ananias? Do we dare to take the story, the gospel of Jesus Christ to the very worst, to those who have hurt us, to those who have shamed us, to those who we say there's no way God can save that person? God challenges us, because we'll jump up when God says, hey, Ben, here am I, Lord. Ben, I want you to go over here, and I want you to talk to this person. Really? I don't want to talk to that person. Do you realize how bad they've hurt me? Yeah. I hung on a cross. That's how bad you hurt me, and still I came for you. You need to go to them. I'm doing something. You may not know this yet, but I'm doing something in their life. You need to go tell them. Will you dare to be an Ananias? Well, we're going to go on with our narrative as we pick up at verse 19. It says, now after several days, he was with the disciples who were in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, he is the Son of God. And all those hearing him continued to be amazed and were saying, is not this the one from Jerusalem? In Jerusalem destroyed those who called on this name, and who came here for the purpose of bringing them bound before the chief priests? But Saul kept increasing in strength and confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that this Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. And when many days had elapsed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him. But their plot became known to Saul, and they were also watching the gates day and night so that they might put him to death. But the disciples took him by night, let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a large basket. You know, I love new Christians. Man, they get saved, and they may not know the Romans road, but I love it to see new Christians. They'll grab somebody and say, you come here, you need to meet my pastor because he's going to tell you how to get saved. I don't know how to do this yet, but he does. Say, come, you need to get saved. That the passion of new Christians. They want everybody to say, I can remember when I got saved. I got saved my sophomore year in high school, and it was just before high school started, and as soon as football season started, I began to talk to other folks, and we had a fellowship of Christian athletes at our high school, and so us Christians started getting together, and we were dragging people to every kind of event where Jesus was talked about, and people were getting saved, and we had lunchtime going on, Bible studies, and it was awesome. When I was a preacher, I was an assistant pastor up in Portland area, and Hunter laughs because I give him Palm Sunday. That's because my pastor, my first pastor out of Bible college, he gave me Palm Sunday to preach. Now, what pastor does that, right? Anyway, I preached on Palm Sunday, and I'm preaching, and this guy comes in, and he comes in late for service, and he sits in the very back row, right on the corner. And I'm preaching on the 7 things that Jesus said from the cross, and I get done preaching, and this guy literally comes running down the aisle. He says, I need to get saved. I lead him to Christ there, and I said, brother, how did you end up here? He said, well, I actually live in Idaho. I pick up used tires for a recycle company in Boise, Idaho. And this is my territory, and I happened to be driving by your church, and I thought, it's Palm Sunday, I need to go in. So Duffy, that was his name, Duffy gets saved. And I said, well, we'll get you hooked up in a church in Boise and let you know, we'll find one for you, and you can start going to church there because that's what you really need to do. And Easter Sunday morning, guess who shows up in church? Duffy, with all of his family. His son, his daughter-in-law, their kids. They had driven all the way from Boise, Idaho to Portland, Oregon, because Duffy said, and he brings all of his family down for him. He says, I don't know how to tell them about coming to Jesus, but I knew you did. And we led the whole family to Christ, and we sent them back and said, listen, we're going to get you in a church over there. You guys don't need to be driving here every Sunday. You see, that joy of that first salvation experience is awesome. But you know what? Not everybody will understand. Did I get that? Don't expect people to immediately forget your past. Don't expect, because they are expecting, they want you to what? Change. Because quite often, we're not very nice before we get saved. They want to see a change. Are you different? And they may hold us off at hand's length. Now, there's kind of an interesting thing that we don't often see between verses 22 and 23 of chapter 9. There's 3 years when it says, when many days had elapsed. I want you to turn over to Galatians chapter 1. In Galatians chapter 1, he's Paul when he's writing here, tells us about this time in Galatians chapter 1, verse 11. He says, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For neither I received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure, and I tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. But when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb, called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus, and then 3 years later I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I call this the Bible college on the backside of the desert. God sent him to the backside of Arabia to get alone with God. You see, you can learn, but he was a learned man. He had studied. He was a Pharisee studying under Gamaliel, who was the head rabbi. He knew all about the Old Testament. But Jesus said, "Listen, I want to take you and I want to school you on how the Old Testament is affecting you. How the Old Testament shows all about me. How the 23rd Psalm, the 22nd Psalm talk about Jesus. How all the way back in the book of Genesis, I was there." And Paul goes to the backside of the desert, and for 3 years, God schools him. And it's only then that God says, now you have the opportunity to go meet the apostles. But he's going to do it in a regular, not in a regular way. Normally it's like, hey, I'm going to head down to Jerusalem and talk to the apostles and see if they'll let me preach at their church. And didn't happen that way, though, did it? An assassination attempt. And poor Paul, this poor guy, over and over again, he gets these people that don't like him. And who are they? The religious people. Because Paul went from being a religious person to be a person that was in relationship with Jesus Christ. And he's telling them he is the Messiah. And so they want to kill him. They put people at the gates. If you see Saul, nab him, because we're going to kill him. And so as we read in the narrative, he's let down out of a basket on the outside wall. Now this is a little interesting tidbit, just a little side piece, that this is the way they dumped the garbage. They had big baskets, and they would fill all their garbage into the basket, and they would lower it down the side of the wall on an outside one, and then they would let the basket dump out, and that was where they. So here's Saul. Imagine, getting in the garbage can, the smelly basket that holds all the garbage, and they let him down, and they dump him out into the garbage heap, and say, "You need to get out of here." Not a very ceremonious way to be ushered out of the city. But he's going to go to Jerusalem. And so let's pick up our story now with Acts 9 and verse 26. And when he came to Jerusalem, He was trying to associate with the disciples, but they were afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. But Barnabas, who's Barnabas? Remember, we met him way back. He was one of those that sold property and gave a gift. He was one of the seven first deacons, called the son of encouragement. But Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles and described to them how he had been seeing the Lord on the road and that he had talked to him, and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. And he was with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, speaking out boldly in the name of the Lord. And he was talking and arguing with the Hellenistic Jews, but they were attempting to put him to death. Oh boy, once again, people don't like Saul when he preaches. I'm glad you guys are okay with the way I preach. But when the brethren learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him on his way to Tarsus. So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria enjoyed peace, being built up, going on in the fear of the Lord, and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it continued to increase. So we talked earlier about daring to be an Ananias. Would you dare to be a Barnabas? They didn't want to have anything to do with him. When he got to Jerusalem, oh, we remember what you were like when you were here. Matter of fact, we still have people that are in prison because you put them there. You think we're going to let you preach in our pulpit? You think just because you come down here and say you're converted, that you've changed, that we're going to let you in? And along comes Barnabas. And I love Barnabas because Barnabas does what? First thing Barnabas does is he hears his story. He listens to Paul. Barnabas wasn't on the road to Damascus when the heavens opened up and God spoke to Saul. How did he learn about that? Saul told him. Saul probably told him about the backside of the desert. Saul probably told him about how he was preaching up there and they wanted to assassinate him, so he got the free garbage ride out of the city. He shares all of these things, and then Barnabas brings him back, and he puts his arm around him and says, listen, guys, he's with me. You accept me, you accept him. He vouched for him. Now, having somebody vouch for you can open up a lot of doors. And it did for him. It says he moved freely throughout Jerusalem, preaching boldly. When I was at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., we made friends with a Secret Service agent who was over all of the logistics. He was the guy who made sure that like if they needed so many cars in such and such a city that it got there, and that was his job. And one day at lunch he says, hey, you guys want to go see the White House? Well, yeah. Well, now anybody can get a ticket to the White House, right? Did you know that? All you got to do, you have to sign up ahead of time because they got to do a background check on everything, and so you sign up and they'll tell you when to show up for your tour. And then you go through all of this procedure where you got to go through the scanners and empty out your pockets. I mean, you thought the airport was bad. So he says, listen, tomorrow, don't show up at the gate where all the people are. We want you to go to the back gate, and you can park there, and then go up and tell them you're here to see me. So the next day, we drive up, park behind. You ever thought about parking behind the White House, right? We park behind the White House in a special lot. We walk up to this guardhouse and we say, we're here to see so and so, and he rings them up he comes walking out of the White House, goes up to the guard, and he says, "They're with me." And we walked right through the gate. No pat down, no questions, no background check. They're with me. We go in the back door of the White House. That's pretty cool. And we walk in and we're going through, and he's showing us the Lincoln bedroom, and he's showing us all this other cool stuff. And we can see, as we pass certain doors, you could see where the public could go, and we're behind the curtain. We're just getting all this cool stuff. He takes us out, and he takes us and shows us they call it the Beast, the big Cadillac that the president rides in. It really does have a red phone in the back that says, Moscow, Berlin, all the 4 or 5. Just pick it up, press a button, and you're going to talk to the president of Russia. We can see all this stuff. Why? They're with me. He vouched for us. We need more Barnabases who will come in, and somebody comes in and they say, "Hey, I don't know what's going on. I've never been in church before." I love that. Because then I don't have any bad habits to deal with. Right? But put their arm around them and say, "Hey, listen, I want to help you grow up in Jesus. They're with me." That gives you access to places that a lot of times, only mature Christians can be here. Now we need to bring them along. Dare to be a Barnabas. And one of the most wonderful things I love about Barnabas is Barnabas stuck with Saul. Barnabas traveled with Saul, or was acquainted with Saul for 14 years. 14 years. Did you notice? Did you see how it happened when he had this death threat, that they took him to Caesarea and they put him on a boat and they sent him to Tarsus? I want you to turn over to Acts chapter 11. In Acts chapter 11, 7 years have passed. Barnabas is sent to Antioch to preach in Antioch, to encourage the people in Antioch. And in verse 23, it says, "When we arrived and witnessed the grace of God, we rejoiced and began to encourage them all with resolute heart to remain true to the Lord. For he," this being Barnabas, "for he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and considerable numbers were brought to the Lord." So what did he do? He stayed there and kept preaching? What did he do? "And he left for Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for an entire year they met with the church and taught considerable numbers. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch." He didn't forget about Saul. Everybody else had said, "You're a rabble rouser. You go back home and you can preach in your hometown, but don't come back to Jerusalem." And Barnabas says, "Wait a second. I need to encourage Saul. I need to see how he teaches and bring him in and be part of the cadre of teachers here in Antioch." And that's exactly what he did. He never forgot Saul. And a matter of fact, their bond is going to be so tight that they're going to go on the first missionary journey. Can you imagine being the first missionary in the church? They're sent out together. Dare to be a Barnabas. Dare to come alongside somebody. And in the end, Saul is going to become a guy by the name of Paul, and he is going to outshine Barnabas. And that's okay with Barnabas.